Okay, so I have hurled together some slides out of one of the lessons I just taught this semester. I'm going to go through them kind of quickly to give you an overview of the idea of releases. If you haven't been doing kind of distro-based, release-based releases up till now in Odyssey. And I offer this up as ideas for discussion. I am not in any way saying you should do this. I'm just, if you've got that kind of, you've grown as this ragtag band of projects up till now, you might want to consider some of these ideas. And even then, this is a set of practices that I've pulled together from across an industry over 20 years. So please don't take any of it as anything other than suggestions. Basically, when you start thinking about a release or of what is Odyssey, you're going to be able to naturally draw lines from your own perspectives. It sounds like there's 2 or 3 very large pieces, and maybe that's where you draw your boundaries. Maybe there's a Hades release train, whereas some of the rest of it doesn't have to be pulled together immediately. And as you look at it from that perspective, maybe you do a couple of the larger pieces first. And then once you have that rhythm, you start to look at, okay, maybe there's actually an Odyssey distro that includes several releases at some of these things. Because remember, the worst thing that I think I've seen in software over 40 years is the idea that there's some developing, and then there's a release, and then there's lots of maintenance. And it's like, no, it's software is something that lives in a constant state of change. There is no maintenance phase. It's just there is always development ongoing. And I think with the kind of the rise of the internet and the rise of the World Wide Web, if anything, we've demonstrated that more and more, that when you pull all of the friction out of the system, software is this malleable machine that is in a constant state of change. And so that means, like when you think about, and let's pick Hades, and I know nothing about this, so I'm now talking with great confidence, as only a man can speak about things that I know nothing about. If we took Hades as an idea, you could start to define a Hades release, and yeah, you're going to fix some bugs, but you're also going to be adding new ones. Just take that as a given. There may be new features that are being added, and that might mean new tools being added in the toolkit. There could be anything from new configurations to new platforms that you necessarily run on. Your installation procedures may change, and you may end up with breaking changes. And those breaking changes, the real gotcha in breaking changes is, as you start to think about releases, you start to step from a world where you had possibly complex instructions for installing things into possibly a world where you've built an installer. But that now means that's another piece of software you have to test. One of the great things you will discover if you don't have a lot of experience with installers is that people will do crazy things, like they'll install version 1 and then they'll skip version 2 and they'll install version 3 and just expect it to all work. And of course, the way you think about it as the core people in the community that actually were building it is, of course, you installed one after another. You never thought to test what would it be to install version 3 on version 1. So like you're stepping into a slightly more complex world when you start to step into these places. From a numbering perspective, people number these things all over the place. You'll often see semantic versioning. That's the traditional major minor patch, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. But you'll also see people give things, named releases. OpenStack was famous for this for a long time. Certainly Ubuntu, always names its releases, and yes, there's a number hiding underneath. But for OpenStack, there wasn't for a long time. OpenStack was just named for its release, and for a long time they named it after the city that the last summit was in. So, you know, people will come up with all manner of crazy naming schemes. Um, and likewise, you know, you'll start to labels get applied to things as well. It's not just, you know, if you have a major minor patch number, you'll also end up with interesting labels that are meaningful when you're looking at things like release candidates or beta tests and things like that. The big thing in this, the reason semantic versioning is so popular as a numbering thing is because it actually gives you a way to think about how are you setting expectations in your user community. That, you know, it's the micro number on the end is really about, you know, typically just bug fixes. You almost never see new features showing up in a micro number change. And so they're obviously backward compatible all the time. Minor numbers, well, okay, so collections of bug fixes, but also you may start slipping in new features, but chances are this is still backwards compatible, but not necessarily forwards compatible. And then there's that idea of, like, in a major, you're allowed to break all kinds of things. And, you know, that the breaking of, you know, data formats, the breaking of protocols, lots of things can change then, and you need to be really, really careful in how you think about that and set those expectations for your user community. These are kind of some of the ideas that you'll find with things that around that backwards and forwards compatibility. A lot of backwards and forwards compatibility has to do with the structure of your software. You know, like a client server could be backwards compatible but not forwards compatible in certain cases, depending on whether the client is changing or the server is changing. You know, a new version of the server, it could be easily backwards compatible, but the client is no longer forward compatible with an old version of the server. So this idea of backwards and forwards compatibility really is dependent on the type of software you're playing with. Typically, the way to think about it is you are going to, I'm assuming folks in this call, at least the folks doing the core engineering around things to date, are comfortable with the idea of branches and branch management. You know, you're going to identify a branch, and that's going to be the branch that you are stabilizing towards, and all patches towards that release go into that branch. It also means that you can continue to do changes against other branches for, you know, if there's an urgent fix that needs to be done, or you've got folks that are continuing, you've agreed on what's going into this release, and now other folks are still working on other features that aren't going into this release. Those features have to go into a different branch. And so, you know, you do need to be thoughtful in how you choose to set up your branching structures and how you're going to manage those. Release management is not for the faint of heart. It is something that, you know, you do want to. There are two ways that folks tend to do releases. There is the one way is there is a release owner, and it becomes the dictatorship of the release owner. You know, they have to get very, very good at saying no. Because even though that thing that you really want to add that would be a really great bug to include in this feature, or it's just this very small new feature, like it really fits with everything else, the release owner needs to be really, really good at saying no. And that means that often your release owner, the release manager, is not necessarily it's not the same skill set as the person who might be kind of the primary community leader, the primary committer in that space. Because your primary committers, their whole job is to say yes to things. Release manager, their whole job is to say no to things. And so there's this idea that, you know, you've chosen a release owner. That release manager is now driving things towards the release train and stabilizing the release and only accepting patches that fit the feature release and the bug release schedule that you've set. The other way folks think about it, there is this idea of voting and, you know, kind of a collection of release managers. You still need a primary release manager to basically keep things on track. But some large projects do get away with kind of a collection of release owners working together instead of kind of a release manager who is a dictator of all. There's a good discussion of this in one of the references that I've pointed you to at the end of the slide deck. Carl Fogel wrote a very good book that is available for free in PDF form. And he goes through the voting system that they used around the Subversion project as to whether or not things were getting in. But even then, you know, you've now added the Subversion community was a very collaborative community run under the auspices of the Apache Software Foundation. And so they already had kind of a preconceived notion of how to work together. So they were able to kind of collectively come up with this release management set of people rather than a single person. And they knew how to work together. Like if you are going to do this with more than a single release manager, now you have to think about how you'll vote for things, just as an added wrinkle. Some of the things that you need to think about is how you're going to package that release. And it is very much, you know, obviously source code is part of the package. That doesn't mean that, let me say it differently. The binary release or the installable release that your end users will have is obviously something that you're kind of guiding yourself towards. That's the thing that you'll be testing that whole release structure for to make sure it, you know, installs over the last release and things like that. But they are derived from a master source distribution. So there needs to always, at this point, like once you start doing releases and packages of releases, you're going to need those kind of canonical, this is the source that went together to provide that package that installs. And everything will have a common label, everything will be, you know, numbered in a congruent manner. So that's the kind of thing you're dealing with. The source.
Oh, Steve, I was wondering if I could share the screen and show our Hades package and get your thoughts on some of the things we're doing with that.
Sure.
Let's see if you can see this. And so this is on our Hades GitHub page. And so Hades actually has got about, I think, 20 projects inside the Hades package.
Okay.
And Martin, I don't know if you want to walk through this, all the work you've done to build maintainers and the code testing that you've got covered for it.
Sure. So yeah, you're right. There are 20 packages. So Hades isn't a single product, and it's not a single release process, unfortunately, maybe. And so each one of these packages has a maintainer. We use semantic versioning. And here we keep track of those packages. We have I think a well-defined release process that also ties the source code to the binary, if you will. So once you have installed a package, it's very easy to trace back the source code that corresponds to what you have installed. We keep track of the coverage of the release process. That's the right column. And then we keep track of the build status of what we call the develop branch, but I think that comes very close to what you're referring to as the release branch. So that's what basically will be the next released version once it's okay.
Do we have release owners and managers?
No, so we have the maintainer of each package, I think, is also the release manager of that package.
Who says no?
Yeah, the maintainer.
The maintainer. So yeah, currently we don't have any structure above that.
And that makes perfect sense for the kinds of things that you're doing. I mean, this looks like a, at a glance, somebody familiar with Hades knows kind of what they can touch and what they can't, and who to go to ask a question if they need to. So this looks like a fabulous dashboard.
Thanks.
And go ahead, somebody was asking a question.
Nope, I just said thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that, remember, I don't live in the Odyssey world, so I'm looking at this from that perspective of not, if I'm coming into this world as a new user, do I have to understand that dashboard? Because that would be a daunting thing for me as a brand new user. But for folks that are managing all of the packages, you've got this great thing there where, as a sophisticated user, as a knowledgeable developer within the Hades community, certainly, I can go to a single place and know exactly what the state and status of things are. So, that's where you may choose to start to think about releases as more of that higher order user thing, but you've already got all of the pieces in place for how you would think about pulling it together from the developer perspective. You could go ahead and ask folks, I want, we're going to pick a date, we're going to shoot for that date, and on that date, if you're going to be included here, you need to be at this status, those kinds of things, where you could think about it as that higher order purpose.
Yeah, so that what you just saw definitely isn't for the end user. So they can, in theory, should be able to install Hades with a single command. But we are for 2022, where we are going to go for a second layer of release, if you will, because I tried to explain we have multiple users. So this is for the hardcore R users. They use the individual packages and therefore they're individually versioned. But then for the people that want the point and click experience, we'll have quarterly releases, at least is the planning, that combine all of these packages into, and what we call skeletons, into single releases every quarter.
Right.
You had a question?
Looks like Stephanie has a question.
Yes, I was just wondering, would there be like a Hello World package for Hades for newcomers to just point and click and test like an initial environment to make sure that everything's okay?
That would be an excellent idea.
Yes, I like that idea. I need to think about we need to think about what exactly that does. But certainly, yes.
I mean, and that's the thing, is like when you start to step into these things where you're trying to improve that onboarding because you're adding that higher order release structure, like there is that test moment, like how do I know it all worked kind of thing? What did I see on my machine, or what can I then run as that easy test case to know that I've done the right thing? Interestingly, Teams is not sharing the chat with me, and I have no idea why.
I'll read you Andrew's question. It's pretty good. Or Andrew, you should ask your question out loud because I think it's a good one.
Yeah, and it's been partially addressed by the conversation, but you may not be aware, there's a set of things that need releases, and they're all strongly interdependent amongst one another for sort of an ideal stack of how you might support the community. So there's the schema for the OMOP itself that has its own versions and releases, and then there's the vocabulary that live in part of that schema, which are updated and have their own releases. There's what we've been discussing mostly so far, which is Hades, which is the appropriate thing to be discussing. But then there's its relationship to the front end that has its own functionality and then provides access to the things in Hades. And so it's complex in that all of those things are strongly interdependent. And I was wondering if there are other communities that have a similarly complicated ecosystem and found strategies for managing releases given that complex interdependence.
So absolutely, there's big complex communities out there, not just any Linux distro or the Linux kernel. OpenStack certainly had that challenge. Kubernetes has the challenge. The Eclipse IDE has that challenge, and the interesting wrinkle there was as the Eclipse project became the Eclipse Foundation, as the nonprofit was layered on top of the project, the nonprofit saw part of its role was to maintain the release train. So it wasn't that developers worked for Eclipse. The developers were still the developers. They were, individuals and member companies, et cetera, across it. But the release manager worked for Eclipse so that they could guarantee the release train and make it a full-time job for somebody. But in other organizations, for Kubernetes, the release manager changes release to release, and there's always that. Again, they try and set up things in such a way that they have this release manager for this release has sufficient helpers that for the next release, one of them, it's their turn to put up their hand. When you have some of these things with large, complex dependencies across things, so it's something that, again, it's a practice thing. It's a complex subject. I think the strong opportunity you have here is the richness of the existing community. You could start to define the small group across all of these big dependent pieces to sit down and start to have the discussion of what would you need to do? What stakes in the ground that would have to happen in each of the large pieces that are dependent on one another if you were to try and define what's an Odyssey distro look like. And is it something that you're targeting, that folks feel comfortable to say, we're going to have a full coordinated distro once a year? Is that a good target, or is it twice a year? Some groups release quarterly, but the ones that are releasing quarterly, they grew up in a process of doing these kinds of releases. I would not suggest in any way, shape, or form that the Odyssey community tries to do quarterly releases when you haven't done one. You want to figure out how much work that is as you step into it. And it'll be a conversation that might take a number of months to have, to really do the homework to figure out, even were you to try and define an existing release just today, like were you to draw the line in the sand and for each of the large components to sit down and try and bring together a distro that you could then install and test, would be a fabulous experiment to find out how far away you are from a process that would allow you to do that with any kind of frequency, or what are the new things that each of the large pieces needs to think about. These are the lots of folks want to have a single right answer before they do anything. And this is one of those places in the complex environment that you folks have done a brilliant job building. You're going to have to experiment, and that's okay. And you're going to learn things, and some of them are some of those experiments will fail, and that's how you learn more things. It's science and engineering, right? So there's not a one right answer here. There are a couple of people I could talk to that I will reach out to. So Paul, if you could take the action item to chase me for a competent release. Well, it's a long story. I will not embarrass myself by demonstrating how inept I can be with technology right now. Paul, if you could chase me to come up with a name or two of a release manager that might be able to give you a more in-depth discussion as the Odyssey community starts to think about a release or a distro might look like.
I'm happy to do that. I think we should promote the name into a release orchestrator, as they have to.
Giving them a fancy name doesn't change the job. They'll still have to say no a lot.
Yeah, all right. Good.
And I didn't want to imply that conversation hasn't started. Mark and Martine and Claire and others have been thinking exactly and having this conversation already. It's part of the context and setting for this whole event, I think, is to further the conversation they've already started and been leading about that. I was mostly asking if there was a sort of a template that might be a useful reference as to kind of help further that. And it sounds like there are several. And so, but I didn't want to leave other listeners who were unaware of it. Lacking appreciation of the good work that they've already been doing in this area.
Yeah, no, it's and installation and release management is hard. That was one of the biggest shocks that I came across, and admittedly 25 plus years ago, is you see a software company and they basically hand the installer off to the juniors. It was the kind of thing that, oh no, it's just the installer. It's not the real software. And it's like that class of problems is horrifically complex to deal with. And you need some of your more senior people on it to actually understand what they're looking at, because otherwise you get that very overly simplistic, well, all of the pieces were installed, but now they don't work, and you don't even begin to understand how to debug the dependencies kind of thing. So I'm going to throw the slides back up again if folks are okay with that. And just the last couple of things in this idea is just, you do actually have to test your releases. That's something that typically, once the release team has finished building the release, is something that, you start asking the rest of the project to rapidly test in those first kind of, the first release candidates before you declare a release. And then there's several references here. Martin Michelmeier worked for HP for a long time, but he's been a long time member of the Linux kernel community, and has done some. He finished his PhD not that long ago. He was late to his PhD, but the discussions and that he's got in some of those papers there are really useful to get a sense of some of the problems that you may encounter and some of the solutions. So I want to talk a bit about culture and governance. Again, recognize that I'm coming at this as a way to have a discussion around framing a conversation. These are things that, based on the sheer breadth of your community, you are probably doing most, if not all, of these things already, and I'm hopefully just giving you a different way to frame it, to think about what's next. There
Steve,
are. Oh, go ahead.
Right before you jump in, Kristen, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I guess maybe you're going to cover this in the next section. So some of these terms, I feel like they could mean different things to different people, like packaging and the testing and things. Are we going to get into that as we go? Is that am I stealing your plot?
No,
Sorry.
actually, so I wasn't going to go deeper into those ideas, because that it's an excellent question. That was, again, this is one of those spaces of I was trying to figure out the level that I was giving a talk in, where I wasn't going to bore you all to pieces. And yeah, package is a classic, because that can mean so many things to so many people.
Yeah, I guess it's worth saying, as a community in Hades, I think we've spent a little bit of time in a debate, although I think it's friendly, and we're trying to get to a point of the flavors of package. So maybe for context for you, we should give a little bit of background that we don't have consensus yet, although I think we're working towards it. And any guidance or really best practices to help us. I think a lot of us have a lot of thinking in this space and are, trying to navigate this, but we could always use more perspective to help balance it out and see what, you know, what good looks like.
Absolutely. I will send you a, Paul, I'd like to ask you to remind me again. There is a wonderful, it's a long read, but there is a blog post written a few years ago. The title is roughly, "So You Think You Want to Create a Package Manager?" Because it's the, I will dig that reference out just so you folks have the counterbalance. A way to think about it is to separate and be really crisp in your definitions. And there isn't a right or a wrong to your definitions, but come up with the ideas it sounds like you're working with. Is you might want to talk about, do you need a package manager? I'm hoping you don't, because package managers are really hard. Package managers are, if you're a Mac user, it's like Brew. Brew is a package manager for Macintosh that sits there and keeps track of when you want to install something. It keeps track of all of the dependencies for that thing that might also require dependencies. So it maintains the entire tree for you, and it keeps track of all of the versions of the dependencies for you and what you need on your machine or have installed on your machine. And it's this amazingly complex problem in software management. And different operating systems call that package management. So you will also see package managers in language communities. So Rust has a package manager. I don't know if R does, but I wouldn't be surprised if R doesn't have a package manager. Go has a way to think and talk about package management. And so you are absolutely correct to say, get really crisp on what you collectively mean. And you can use some of these other examples, like, well, what does the Rust and community mean with, Rust and crates kind of thing? Or, what does it mean for an operating system and Brew on the Mac? But it's okay in this space for you to come up with your own terminology as long as you all agree on it and are consistent on it. And so there is that idea of, are you talking about a release? And is the release everything that you need across all of Odyssey to land on a new user's machine for them to be able to use Odyssey in its entirety? Is that what you mean by a release? Or do you want to call, do you want to think of that as more of a distro, and a distro has releases? Because of the large moving dependent pieces within the Odyssey world, you might want to, break it down into a tiered approach of, there's an overarching Odyssey release, but before you get there, for an Odyssey distro with a release number, you know that you need to at least get good at these separate pieces being in this kind of release fashion, so that the overarching distro becomes, these pieces at these revision levels now make up this Odyssey distro at this revision level. So you've got lots of flexibility in what makes sense in your community. As you said, though, you just have to make sure you all agree on the terms. The thing I want to encourage here, if there's a certain amount of debate about what terms mean, is don't get too caught up necessarily in what the other language communities or operating system communities do. They're great models, but that doesn't mean it's right for you. So, by all means, steal language from these other communities that do this kind of distro management and package management and release management, but come up with the thing that makes the most sense for your community of use, and then write it down. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
And that's really, that's what this section is about. It's culture and governance. There is a set of things that I laugh, because the next few colorful slides are stuff that literally there's a dozen of us that give talks about these things reasonably regularly, and you could almost swap our slide decks and we just stand up and give the other person slide deck. Because we all have a trust and transparency slide. And it is one of those things where, it's a community value in a healthy open source community culture runs on transparency. There's clear communications, there's documented decisions, there's documented process, and this is the way you build trust in that community. Because especially, it sounds like the Odyssey community is very widely distributed geographically. And so as soon as you start to, mix geographical locations and time zones and cultural backgrounds and languages, you need ways to be able to build trust quickly. And the cleanest way to do that is to write it all down in a place where everybody can see it. Even if they weren't there for the meeting, they can see either the recordings like this one, or they can find the minutes, they can see the discussions in archived email threads and things like that. We all have a slide where we talk about this bias for work. Typically, it comes up with, you need people that are willing to chop wood and carry water. A lot of what this has to do is it's the hard work. It's the hard stuff that you are already doing. That's why Odyssey is the success that it is today, is because clearly you've got some core folks here that have that bias for doing the work. And some of it is very unglamorous work, building that dashboard. It looks cool, but that wasn't glamorous work, but it's incredibly useful once it's done at making sure that everybody understands that, this is something that benefited the whole community, so that the developers in that core Hades community can quickly look at the dashboard and understand exactly the state of the project. This was my contribution to our common slides, is this idea of, I always paraphrase the old JFK inauguration speech, and it's your community isn't there to do stuff for you, so to speak. The intent, you have to walk into it from the other perspective. You are building a community that will do work, but you have to, honor that fact that community building is in and of itself hard work. And so that there is a certain amount of effort that has to go into that. And so encouraging, people to become maintainers in your project of building the community is an important on-ramp. Likewise, these discussions often degenerate to codes of conduct, but there is that having a code of conduct, but setting that cultural expectation of, respect and inclusion is important at this point in history. We have a terrible set of numbers in our industry at large when it comes to diversity numbers, but it's even worse in the open source community. And I honestly can't tell you why it's so different in that space. I have suspicions, but I don't have data to back up those suspicions. But it's become just an important thing that you need a code of conduct at this point in history. Of course, the thing you'll quickly discover if you have a code of conduct is you need a process for actually managing the code of conduct. But these are some of the important things as you start to think about what is the culture in the Odyssey community. Lots of folks want a template for governance, and this is actually the template that Sarah came up with when she was building the Kubernetes community. This is how simple it is. There isn't a better recipe. There is no better playbook for this. Yeah, it's understanding that you're basically write down what you're doing, write down how you make decisions as a community, and make sure you document those roles, and then know that you're not going to get it right, and that you're going to have to iterate. And when it comes to this idea of writing things down, you know, examples of all of the things that you could be writing down, like there could be a page in a wiki or a page on a website or a page in your GitHub repo right now that describes, you know, these things individually or collectively. And it is just setting the expectations. This is how this community works. This is how this piece of the community works. Again, it sounds like Odyssey is such a broad community with different large moving parts. You may have a collection of governance. And as you write it down, so to speak, you know, you may discover that, okay, there's some divergence across things. And that allows you at that next level up to figure out, do you need to converge them, or is it okay because you actually have things written down regardless, and that's how this sub-community works. A lot of folks want to step into the value discussion. I used to hate these discussions, but again, it was Sarah that educated me by giving me the Kubernetes example. So these Kubernetes, about 3 years in to the project, actually tried to document its values. And that's where it came up with these ideas of community over company and distribution over centralization, improvement over stagnation, and automation over process. You know, if you could automate something, then you automated it. You didn't just document the process. And you then evolved your documentation to point to the automation. But the core overarching idea when the steering committee sat down, you know, well into the growth of the project, when there was already hundreds of people involved, was they were trying to come up with the values that they could document and articulate that would enable folks to make decisions without bringing everything to the steering committee. So it wasn't values in that traditional sense of, you know, we believe in respect and integrity kinds of thing. No, they were trying to define a set of values to a very particular need in that growing community. And so that's if anything, I think a really healthy way to think about values. Yeah, and a lot of this comes back to this idea of culture. And this is kind of the space that a core group of us have been wrestling with over the last couple of years. You know, maybe the pandemic is giving us too much time to think about these things. Yeah, you can always go with the, you know, I always reach for the OED, but we all kind of have that rough understanding of what culture is and what governance is and we might not have said it quite as clearly as Oxford did here, but I still, there's something missing in this definition. And so I actually work with a slightly bigger definition. And what the real kicker here is that this idea that you are basically creating something that evolves, is geared towards success, of whatever success means to the community, but also captures that idea of it's covers across generations. You know, it's the morals and ethics. You know, if you take philosophy, you understand it's the difference between, you know, what people think versus what they do. It's bounded by a community of people, and in your case, remember, it includes those freeloaders, all of those people in your tribe. It involves carefully, but organically. This is the thing. There isn't a clean playbook for this is how you build a community. You know, you have to kind of approach it as a community, and you're creating success, whatever that success means, whether it's, you know, simple survival or growth and thriving along the way. But the across the generations, that's the real kicker that we've realized is important. It's how do you create that resiliency in your community, and how do you create kind of an enduring relationship? This is something that we're learning the hard way watching the Kubernetes community right now. And it's interesting because if you take a look at what OpenStack was before it kind of hit this hiccup in its adoption and it somewhat collapsed, the community itself of developers and projects is actually healthier than what we're seeing right now in the continued wild growth in Kubernetes, where they didn't pay attention to this kind of cross-generational aspect of teaching culture. You know, what does the day zero welcoming event look like?
So,
How do you, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Let's see. So one thing, I had a hard time understanding this as well, and I watched a few of your videos with Sarah. One thing that helped me was driving home was really understanding an example of community over company. You know, how does that go? How does that actually play out as an anti-pattern for potential failure for an open source organization?
So this is the interesting thing, and Kubernetes. So the elephant in the room in the Kubernetes world that nobody understands is Kubernetes was a very particular strategic play by a brilliant and evil product manager at Google to change the nature of the conversation of what does it mean to deploy software in the cloud at a time when Google was third in the cloud and Amazon was this tearaway first. And everybody in the world talked about AMIs, basically Amazon virtual machines. That was the way you did software. You did it with VMs. And so instead, Kubernetes was an attempt to use an open source project strategically to create a new conversation in the industry that happened to be something Google was extraordinarily good at, and happened to make use of a misunderstanding of what containers were and the rise of the popularity of Docker. At this point in history, Google still controls all of the reasonable things in that project community. And they've been giving away control for a very long time. But at the end of the day, they still have kind of the controlling positions in all of the different special interest groups that matter. And so it's been a fascinating experiment, might be a word for it, in what Sarah built, setting this framework in motion to give away control and to build this very healthy culture. And at the same time, and to even have a value that says community over company. And to see the framework of participation that she developed get to that point, but to still have Google basically at the center of the web. And so this is the joy of Odyssey, is it's the reverse situation. You don't have a single company that did a thing. You know, this isn't Google creating Kubernetes or even, you know, Microsoft creating, you know, TypeScript or .NET Core or things. So you've got a genuine community that is growing up around this software, where the community comes from a wide range of places, be it academic or corporate users or researchers. So I think you're in a much healthier place there.
But we really do want to get more companies to contribute more maintainers. And,
Yep.
and I like the idea of also trying to help provide some protection from liability of collusion at the company level too, so that we can you know, be more welcoming for other companies to be involved in our activities.
Yep. So we will get there very shortly. So really, the only thing that was missing when Sarah and I actually the talk that Paul's referring to, Sarah and I gave a talk I guess it was 2 years ago now. 2 years? My brain is so pandemic addled with respect to calendars. I have completely lost track. Sarah and I gave a talk together on it. And the one thing that we would add to this slide came out of that talk, is that extra idea that you need the project needs to find a way to teach the next generation as people are coming into it. You know, not only do you have a responsibility to recruit the next generation, going back to what Martine was saying, but you also you have a responsibility to teach them the culture. And that really is, to a certain extent, you know, it's ritual transmits culture. And when I say ritual, a word that many of us are uncomfortable with, I want to give you a direct example. I'm the governing board chair in the Confidential Computing Consortium. And one of the things that I started doing literally back in our planning phases 2.5 years ago was I kept hammering home at every one of the meetings as we lifted this into place as a collection of corporate partners. You know, every member's welcome, every project is welcome. You know, we're a transparent, collaborative community. And I kept hammering that point home. They were sick of hearing me say it. And it got worse because not only did I continue to say it in every meeting and remind everybody of this, but then I started putting it on this is the first slide of every meeting. You know, there's the title slide with the date, and then this slide comes up. Actually, the one other slide, because it's a Linux Foundation thing, the antitrust slide is put up, and then this slide before we actually get to the agenda and I started doing that with every meeting. Now, I was governing board chair, but as we set up in motion both the Technical Advisory Council and the outreach, I was the original chairs of those two groups until I could get people in place. But again, I kept using this slide over and over again. And so now, and I literally read this slide. It is ritual. And
oh, Kristen, you had a comment?
Yeah, I guess I just want to ask. So one thing we struggle with, and I just want to like ask, since you use this a lot, how do you enforce like that last statement in the absence of being like a company, just a community? Like we struggle with, how do we really know we're ensuring a community that is harassment free? Like how does that come to life?
So that is a wonderful subject of its own. So this is actually, I'm trying to find good answers for you and
You
answering.
can just tell me to shut up. That's okay too.
No,
I'm just
not
really
at all,
curious
because
because
no.
this is our biggest
So
problem, I think, is we don't know how to enforce a statement. And if you had best practice or even loose examples, I think that would be good food for thought. You can come back to it for sure.
So the thing I would encourage is take a look at a code of conduct. The code of conduct reference that I had earlier in this talk, I think it's code of conduct covenant are the words you're going to Google. Again, I'm sorry, Paul, but if you could take a note.
Is it the same as the contributors covenant?
Yeah, it's the contributors covenant, but the thing you want is you want to look at version 1.4, not the current release 2. And the reason for that, without getting too nuanced on all of this discussion, because it is a prickly discussion, is 1.4 still leaves lots of room for everybody to walk away from a conversation with dignity. Because it could just be that somebody was having a bad day and was rude. And having a quiet discussion with that person may be the way that everybody, you know, there's an apology and everybody walks away again with their dignity intact. There is no name and shame, so to speak. Unfortunately, the Contributor Covenant 2.0 steps into the space of kind of a laddered set of punitive measures. And once you step into punitive measures, you change the entire nature of the conversation. And so I would encourage that you take a look at, you know, like I said, version 1.4, not 2.0. And actually even just in the comparison of them, and I'm happy to have this discussion offline because it's also a very active discussion in the community. Folks started having code of conduct discussions probably 5, 6 years ago. One of the, let me give you 2 quick examples of how right something can work and how wrong something can work. And it was great because that happened about 3 years ago, and they happened back to back. Sarah was on the steering committee in the Kubernetes project. And over a weekend, somebody raised on Twitter, of all things, because they are a younger generation, and by definition, all things will be shared on social media. They complained on Twitter that somebody was harassing them in the Kubernetes community. Sarah, fortunately, saw it, very quickly responded, and said, "You're right. We have a code of conduct, and we have absolutely no policy for what to do with that code of conduct. Here's what's going to happen. The steering committee was going to meet over the next 3 days, and on Wednesday, we will actually have a policy for our code of conduct. We will apply it to this situation, and we will let everybody know the result." And then 3 days later, they did exactly that. And in letting people know the result, they said, "Look, this is our first attempt with a policy on our code of conduct, and here's what the code of conduct committee thinks we're going to do. We will revisit this discussion, this particular decision, again in 12 months. And we also know that this is a first kick at the policy." Go back to the previous couple of slides back of, you're going to iterate, basically empathize and iterate. We don't presume we've got it right. That entire thing from the Sunday tweet, instantly the conversation was now framed as, oh, the steering committee has to do something, and we're doing it in this very tightly timed thing. So that shut down all discussion publicly. Basically, people waited to see what happened. And then the decision was handed down. It was a reasoned decision based on a hurriedly put together but reasoned policy around the code of conduct. The person who was possibly doing the harassing was not entirely pleased with the decision, but it was very clear that they would revisit it again in a time frame. It was not a career-shattering moment for anybody. And everybody got on with their lives. So, as a best practice, having a code of conduct you can point to, and then having a simple policy that you can then use to say, this is how you report something against the code of conduct. You will discover that, yeah, people will do that, but it's about having a discussion. So many people there are just enough horror stories. Let me give you the other one. In the Drupal community, at DrupalCon, their big annual gathering, and again, this was all pre-pandemic, somebody showed up at the conference with their slave. I don't need to say anymore, but one might imagine this freaked out a lot of people. And the unfortunate flip side, nobody did anything or said anything. So there was a lot of outrage. There was a lot of people that were genuinely deeply offended and or uncomfortable in all manners of ways. And this again, I'm not giving you any detail here, so your own imaginations are already running amok for you. And none of us have the detail. But the problem was the community did nothing for weeks. And so the debate escalated and escalated, and the vitriol level escalated, and it became a huge, raging debate in that community. And this is a community that's been around for, at that point, comfortably 15 years. This was not a bunch of new folks getting to know each other. And it was because the leadership in that community was scared to step in. They didn't until way too much time had passed and way too much angry vitriol had been dumped into this thing for mostly no good reason. And there was no easy way to then back the discussion back to something that could have perhaps been a simpler discussion around, with no judgment about consenting adults and practices. Maybe you could get a room, so to speak, and just taking it out of the context of this community is actually about the Drupal project. And how you choose to live in all of your other rich communities is your choices, kind of thing. But it's like these things are difficult and they can blow up in horrible ways, where I'm betting that 90% of what you'll have to deal with, maybe 99%, is somebody being basically discourteous in email or a conversation. And that's one of those things where kind of having some guidelines, having the ability to point to the guidelines and be able to have the back channel of just having a quiet conversation. That was rude. Well, I was angry, or they were no, like, and working your way through that discussion so that everybody walks away with dignity. It's something that's becoming a skill set that lots of folks are learning that they need to have in these kind of communities. And it is important to get good at it. It's not that everybody in the community has to be good at it. Everybody has to understand we have an expectation of courtesy and civility in this community. It's.
Hey, this is Sri. I mean, is it okay to ask questions in general, or my question may not be directly related to what is going on in this topic, but I do have an open source question.
Please.
Yeah. So I'm a founder of a nonprofit open source for remote patient monitoring solution. And we started thinking that it'll be all open source, but now we're getting some entities that want supported version of it and hosted version of it.
Yep.
My question is, do foundations like this continue to just offer that or do they create separate entities to do that? Is it okay to offer those kinds of support
perfectly
services?
setting up the next couple of topics.
Oh, that is okay. All right, cool. I'll just wait then. Thank you.
So this is like the whole space around codes of conduct and harassment. It's a really sensitive subject, but I think the thing is to know that you need to have the conversation to kind of start to lay down that idea of we have a code of conduct. Like I said, it's a hot subject right now. So and to put a framing around it. I am, as an Eclipse board member, we are having this discussion actively right now and seeking counsel. And by counsel, I mean lawyers, to ensure that we've buttoned down things reasonably. At the same time, the Linux Foundation is going through this because for the breadth of things they're touching right now, CNCF, that's the nonprofit wrapped around the Kubernetes project and another collection of related projects, they have some real problems in that space. Some of them reasonably catastrophic. And so this is a really active space in discussion right now. So I can't give you hard and fast rules or expectations because this is such an active place of discussion right now. But know that it's a really important one. And I just had a last couple of quick slides in this space. One is lots of folks think that when they step into the governance space that they're really, we need to talk about voting. And I try to get people away from that discussion. In that previous organization, the Confidential Computing Consortium, we've literally been trying to tear down our voting systems so that voting in the nonprofit, so distinct from the project, but in the nonprofit, is really about the boring things of, well, you have to vote on your minutes, and voting on the budget once a year is important, and voting on membership in terms of how we set the fees to make sure we have enough money coming in to handle the budget money going out. And that's about as much voting as I encourage us to have. Everything else is basically done sociocratically. And by that, it is very much, it's done by consensus. And here, consensus is, it's the IETF. They still hum in meetings, in working groups. It is a room full of grown adults humming. As a general, like, do we think we're in consensus here? Does anybody really care that somebody, there's that idea that consensus is the absence of supportable objection. If somebody wants to do work in a project, you should find ways to say yes to them doing work. They're trying to give you something. This isn't about necessarily having a vote on things all the time. It's about trying to enable work. It's going back to that idea of, you're a collection of people volunteering time. That doesn't mean that you all don't have day jobs that mostly pay for that time, but you're still volunteering time towards a community endeavor. So you should be trying to find ways to say yes and enable that cooperation. Now I'm just going to close the section off with that the fine quote from David Clark on the IETF world back in 1992. This is that idea of rough consensus and running code. That's really how the IETF manages to get so much done. Yeah, the fact that we're even having this meeting, virtually across all of the different protocols and software that enable this to work is because the IETF continues to live by this rough consensus and running code process and kind of ethos that they've been doing for a long time now. So that's what I have to say about culture and governance at this point. I can walk folks through the high points on what nonprofits are all about, because these next three topics I want to cover them relatively quickly to give you a flavor of what I think the next big questions you're going to start to encounter are.
That would be very helpful, Stephen. This is a question in the back of all of our minds. What comes next?
Yep, and that's so. There is a classic history to nonprofits, and that is, you had this wonderful idea that there was a project, there were some maintainers, and there was some contributors, and there was a growing community, and this base of code grows up into this massive ecosystem. And you point to the success of some of the different pieces of the Apache world, the success of the Linux kernel, MySQL, things like that, and that there's like everybody feels really good. Oh, there's this whole ecosystem out there. The reality, of course, is different. What happens is if you're doing it right, if you're an Odyssey, whether or not you've been structuring those on-ramps the way I've talked about them today, you've clearly been building those on-ramps, or at least pieces of them, in very successful ways because of the broad adoption that you're seeing. You end up at a place which it sounds like you're starting to bump into of you may start to see personal liability problems. Now, I suspect I know why you're not seeing that happening in Odyssey. And then the other is you'll start to see corporate contributors start to show up that want a better understanding of what Odyssey means. And the problem with this is your evolution stops, and it stops hard if these are real problems. It was absolutely a real problem in the Apache web server space. You were getting to the point where multiple companies were showing up because they wanted to use Apache HTTPD at the heart of whatever large product they were going to sell to customers. And so they were trying to understand, so what's Apache? Who's Apache? Who do I call when something breaks kind of problem? And, who controls it is always a big one that companies want to know. At the same time, you had basically a collection of developers scattered across a set of universities. That was the original HTTPD, community project. And the idea that any of them would take on personal liability around corporate interest, or even the personal liability of, if you tried to have a meetup or a conference, like who hosts the bank account? Whose credit card picks up the pizza or the beer? And that all of a sudden, now you're into personal liability spaces. And those can escalate really quickly. And even if you have companies that are willing to say, well, I'll cover that for you. Again, the company, unless they're putting it on their credit card, if they want to write a check to you, whose bank account takes the check? It's these kinds of problems that started showing up. So historically, the way you solved for that was you created a nonprofit. Nonprofits are basic, they are a legally structured corporation that happens to have interesting tax exempt properties. And in the United States, they are typically 501c3. That's something for the community good, for the public good. So organizations like the Apache Software Foundation, the IETF, organizations like that are 501c3s. The other group is a 501c6. That is a collection of corporations that are going to ensure, the running of the organization, but that also means you now need antitrust protections basically embedded in that, so that there are certain rules that have to happen to demonstrate that these companies are not colluding and creating antitrust situations. And so that's the legal structuring of these things. And at that point, it provides kind of liability management for both companies trying to manage their risk as well as individuals, contributors trying to manage their risk. It creates a space of IP neutrality for those companies, so that no one company feels like it's contributing to the other company's success. Google created the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, as the nonprofit umbrella for Kubernetes and other related projects. Because if they held that property tightly in its ownership control, the rest of the world would not have contributed to it. Why am I going to contribute to Google's success? So that was kind of part of the rationale, and that's how these things worked for a long time. The URL at the bottom of that slide, that's an article that Paula Hunter and I wrote. It was around 2013. We were running a nonprofit at the time. Paula was the executive director. I was the technical director. And this was the first time any of us had tried to generalize one of these organizations. The Apache Software Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, the Linux Foundation, these things had very explicit purposes around very explicit projects. And we were trying to generalize something. And so we had to actually figure out for ourselves and then explain to people, why would you give us money? What are we doing for our projects? That was a first attempt at explaining that. And to this day, it still looks like the first attempt I can find. I recently found in book format something that was done, I think around 2015 or 2016. And basically, you're reading a graduate thesis that has been published as a book. And it doesn't go any further than what we covered in that document. It was a difficult thing to articulate for folks. But when you see the kind of thing that did happen, and I'm not suggesting it will happen the same way here, so please don't get excited. But
Steve, before you jump on,
sure.
I don't know, did you want to share why you personally don't think we've hit any liability? We've got 20 some working groups where we know we've got many industry partners collaborating in those working groups, and why aren't we hitting some of the antitrust concerns with those?
So antitrust concerns are a very explicit bucket of things to worry about. So right now you don't have that because you have a collection of people that are all basically individuals, or at least a substantial number of them are individuals, possibly representing, research organizations and other nonprofit entities that are making decisions together. Antitrust comes in when you only have a collection of companies. So when you look at the Apache Software Foundation, that was a collection of individuals, and companies wanted to participate. So they helped create the Apache Software Foundation to give the project a healthy base, and then all of those companies felt comfortable contributing. They didn't need the antitrust protection of a C6. They were happy with a C3.
That's excellent. Thank you. Peter, you have a question?
Contrast that with by the time you get to, so that was 99, by the time you get to 2004, 5 years later, when the Eclipse Foundation is set up, please understand, it's the same group of IBM lawyers involved. They set up the Eclipse Foundation as a C6 because it was very explicitly a set of companies that wanted to do something together. So you had to have antitrust protection in place.
Okay. Excellent. Peter?
Yeah, hi, Stephen. I'm Peter Rijnbeek. I'm from Erasmus Medical Center in the Netherlands. I've been in the Odyssey community and open source community for a very long time. And at some point, I thought it would be nice to step out of the community for a bit and step into another open source community, just to see how this is working. And I actually went to the Moodle community, which is a very active community on e-learning system. But also to the Superset community, which is Apache incubated now.
Okay.
Also a very active community. And both of them actually made that step to a organization. And I think one of them actually is a company more that's driving, but it's still open source and contributing. And Moodle is also a very sophisticated and very developed community where you actually move to all those points you had on your slide 66 with services and training and everything around that, where there's a lot of activity from additional companies that help out maintaining that community. And I feel that this is where Odyssey is at. Actually, we are very close to that. We are doing all kind of different services in the community, and I'm just wondering whether we should put more effort in that to really make that big next step. Because I've seen in the other open source communities as Moodle and Superset that they really got a very big uptake when they did that, because you got a lot of people that are very dedicated only to developing the code, and we do a lot of work ourselves outside of developing code. So it's a different situation, I think, than we are currently working in.
Yep, exactly. And that's why I think this next step, I think, is really important, and that's what this piece was here for, because it's a trade-off, and the kinds of, and it's a trade-off that you need to be very eyes wide open about, because good people occasionally do bad things in the name of money. And it's one of those things, like, so when the example here, like when the pent up demand to contribute to Apache by corporate members, potential members in that community, the jump in code from May 99, when as they were forming the Apache community, to September, so basically in a season, they jumped from 30,000 lines of code to 90,000 lines of code. Now, that wasn't all freshly written. That was code, that was all of the different forks sitting inside of companies that they were experimenting with. BAE Systems, IBM, there were lots of folks that had been exploring this Apache thing that wanted to contribute. And like you say, they had dedicated developers at IBM that were doing nothing but writing Apache code.
Yeah, what I
So-
really liked about the interaction that we had with the superset, so we organized a meeting with them just to talk to the community and ask them this type of questions on how are you doing releases, how are you managing your code? And one thing that I found indeed striking was that they had dedicated people that managed the releases and were responsible, as you mentioned earlier in your presentation. All those things were in place there and were very strictly controlled. And I found it in some way very comfortable and very professional and efficient how they actually approach that problem.
And so places like Apache, places like Eclipse, they've become extraordinarily good at providing that kind of supporting infrastructure, and providing a set of playbooks. And I might need to explain this because I said there are no playbooks. Providing a set of playbooks that work in that community setting. And so the interesting challenge with Apache right now is, again, they haven't necessarily done a great job over the generations of training the next generation in why certain things are done certain ways. But it's still, they've got kind of this, the Apache way is a well understood way of accomplishing, the release mechanisms and things like that. The interesting contrast, and all of these things have exceptions. So Apache is a C3 organization. It's there for the public good. If you put aside some of the other projects and just look at the growth of the Apache web server, the original HTTPD project, that continues to be healthy. 25% of the web's traffic still flows through Apache web servers. And that's fallen over the last 5 years from about 50% because more and more folks are using Nginx. But Nginx is owned by a company. That means that any day they could relicense it. That's not to say it would be easy for them or anything else, but it's a possibility. There is a particular Apache project that started as a corporate contribution. It actually came in from LinkedIn back before Microsoft acquired LinkedIn. And it was rich background tooling that LinkedIn happened to use. It wasn't core to their mission in any way. They were happy to share it. And it developed a really rich community. A group of people came along with some venture capital and started a company to provide that exact, let's provide a supported version of this. And over time, it's ended up becoming something that has become less useful to the broad community, because slowly that company has tightened down they are all of the primary committers now, or most of the primary committers. So they only want their changes to be going in, or they discourage other changes. And you've watched what was a very healthy project that is even under the Apache Software Foundation slowly becoming unhealthy. There's never a guarantee here. That's why the culture you defined for Odyssey so far is so important to the next steps that you take. And go ahead.
And I agree with Christian's comment way in the beginning of the day that, of course, we don't have one single tool. So we don't have one application that Apache is managing with their rules, but it's a combination of all of those individual elements in Hades, for example. But there needs to be a way in the middle where we put a bit more control on it without losing that nice, flexible, and transparent and open character of the Odyssey community.
Well, and that's
I'm looking for that hotspot.
Well, and the reason, so I wanted to go through these 3 sections fairly quickly to give you that sense. But what worries me, I guess the overarching warning I want to keep coming back to is you need to own your own destiny here. And what I mean by that is, just because there's a nonprofit doesn't mean magic happens. There are an uncomfortable number of failures coming in the Linux Foundation's future, because the Linux Foundation has no culture. And there's a rush of new projects racing to the Linux Foundation because they think they need a nonprofit. And who better than the company, the organization that gave us the Linux kernel and Kubernetes. And they're rushing there and they're being handed a simple legal structure and they're paying their dues because all of the legal structures are C6 structured. So it's companies joining, not individuals or universities or anything like that. And then it's kind of like there are no playbooks. And since these projects don't necessarily know how to collaborate the way you folks in Odyssey have already learned to collaborate together. I want to keep bringing you back to your successes. And so they're standing there thinking that somehow now that they're a structured piece of the Linux Foundation, that magic's going to happen. And it's not going to happen. You need folks like yourselves who know how your community work. That doesn't mean you can't improve your community or you can't add some structure to your community. But you are that community and you are the heart and soul of this thing. And it's important to hold on to that. The other thing is that, I can tell you what nonprofits are good for, but remember, you're going to have to still run the nonprofit. Because if you give up control of if you pretend you created a nonprofit tomorrow, if you give up control of that nonprofit, then you're back into that space of, well, it could go places you don't want it to go as the existing community. And so the other people can do things for you or provide certain things to you. And actually, just to wander through the end of this piece, a colleague did a number crunch. The link is at the bottom there, over 10 years ago now. And they basically discovered, at the time, you could get a hold of the data to do this number crunch a lot easier than you can today. And they discovered that the 9 most vibrant communities out there were all hubbed in nonprofits. And the 10th was an order of magnitude smaller, and it was hubbed in a company. And he was a good engineer, like he did not claim causality here. But clearly there's a strong correlation between what a nonprofit can provide and what the project on its own without the nonprofit legal structure wrapped around it does. And there's ways to think about it. Like I basically added an on-ramp. There's a collection of IP management activities. I do need to update this a little bit because I was more driving home on the IP management side than the liability side. But there's, you're basically adding to this overarching set of, there's the software construction maturity, the community development activities. There's also a set of IP management activities. And what you're really doing there is driving kind of this fourth on-ramp. That is, how do you encourage and manage corporate contributions? And today Martine gave me a fifth on-ramp that I'm going to have to work into this now of how do you build the next generation of maintainers. But I'll get there. It's an evolving model.
I was thinking that they were similar because usually corporations are going to have the funding to be able to staff maintainers.
So, and therein lies that you're setting up the next section. Because the exact problem we're running into at this point is, a lot of the modern foundation work, here's the same stylized idea, except the reality is lots of folks are rushing existing new open source licensed projects into this discussion, and they don't even have a community yet. You see, you're further along. Odyssey is further along already, but because of this, a lot of folks, I think, are making the mistake that they're forgetting that an open source project is not a way to find customers. And that's why, so some of these folks that are coming to the Odyssey community broadly today and saying, I'd really like a supported version of Odyssey that, has kind of a push button installer. Okay, I am betting that, with within a reasonably short period of time, because we live in a modern world and VCs are happy to gamble with other people's lives, that we could come up with a startup funded to do exactly this. We could even make it sound super sexy because you're in the open data space as well as the open source space. And, we can even push the whole data science platform perspective. And the problem is that will turn the Odyssey community, if it's handled badly by that startup, they will chase your community away from you because they will be trying to use the community as a set of customers. And that doesn't work. And we can talk about that. The last thing, just though, to kind of close out about the interesting things that nonprofits can do. And I don't know if either of these models would work at all for Odyssey, but I offer them up as interesting models. Eclipse, early in its existence as a nonprofit, actually wrestled with this exact problem. How do we provide our member companies, because they are a C6, they are a technical corporate member organization, and they have a responsibility to provide antitrust protections. But how do they provide real value to these other corporate members? And so they basically took on that as the nonprofit. They took on the role of building a market platform. And when I say build a market platform, I mean an economic platform. Think of a credit card. A credit card is useful at solving for a market problem, but you've got a two-sided market that you have to build. You need enough people accepting the credit card and enough people using the credit card to attract one another, kind of thing. So it's a difficult platform play, but it's a really interesting platform play. And that's what they created for the Eclipse IDE. And then they basically, to do that, they took on the role of being the release manager to ensure a very dependable, predictable release train for all of their members that had plugins for the IDE. And then they turned around and built the actual marketplace for those plugins, so that all of these companies could list their plugins. Now, some of the plugins were free, but some of them were actually paid for plugins. And then the other thing that the Eclipse Foundation, what the nonprofit was doing, was building that onboarding for new Eclipse IDE users that were just happy to be in that community. They were just users of the IDE. But now all of a sudden you've got those people showing up to get the IDE, and on the same website, there's an easy place to go get plugins for your particular development needs, some of which were provided by members at cost, like for money. The Eclipse Foundation was not taking a cut of that at all, because that would have ruined their nonprofit status. And so it was just a really interesting way for a nonprofit to not simply provide IP neutrality for all of its members, but to actually take that next step and build a marketplace. So that was kind of an interesting thing that they did. The other was actually the Drupal organization. The Drupal organization has been building their marketplace because they are an organization that, for the most part, again, the Drupal content management system, that's the basic platform. But they've been figuring out ways to recognize their community community contributors, both as individuals and as organizations. And they've been driving a marketplace where you're ranked based on your contributions, and contributions take the form of either time, talent, or direct. They joke it's time, talent, or treasure, where treasure means the company paid something, and sponsored an event or sponsored the organization, things like that. And so they've been building out their marketplace there of folks, and it's a rich marketplace of different folks with different plugins or different design services or all of the things you might imagine a content management system would need. So there's additional things that nonprofits can do well beyond the simple manage liability and provide IP neutrality. So I want to park that there and take that next step over to briefly talk about an example of engineering economics, and then wrap up with talking about products and projects, just to kind of bring the companies in. And I'm going to go through this piece fairly quickly because it's probably the least interesting to this discussion. I just want to make sure that everybody understands that as you step into this exact space of customers and companies and folks consuming versus producing, this is consumption economics here. So this is people pulling Odyssey into their world. Every product or IT manager understands the historical build versus buy decision. And when you take OSI licensed projects, and I have to stress, in well-run communities here, you're basically extending that decision into a build versus buy versus borrow and share. And the cleanest example with numbers that I can give you is actually one from my background. We were a startup back in the late 90s. We were basically building the Unix front end on Windows NT. Roughly 300 packages of software off the interwebs, covered by about 30 different licenses. This was all before the open source definition existed. We were running across 3 different physical architectures, and we needed to replace the Microsoft compiler. The challenge in that build versus buy, we were a venture-backed startup. We had limited capital. The internet bubble was just starting to heat up. It hadn't exploded yet. And I had a relatively small team of folks. The R&D team was about 20 people complete. That included, all of our support and QA folks. I could pivot them all to build a compiler. Flip side is I could have bought a compiler, but even then, if I started buying the compiler in a supported way from Intel and DEC, that would have been hundreds of thousands of dollars at that point and didn't solve for my MIPS problem. But at the time, the GNU compiler suite, GCC, was a stable, robust compiler environment that was probably 5, 6, 7 years old at that point. And so when we started looking at that, if you actually kind of run it through by the numbers, it ran on all the architectures we cared about. I hired an extraordinarily experienced compiler developer out of HP who was even used to multiple hardware architectures. And I hired them for about $100K a year. This is a while ago now. And, in 6 to 8 months, we had GCC up and running in our environment. GCC itself was on the order of 750,000 lines of code. We're talking, depending how you run it through the COCOMO model, $10 to $20 million worth of value in that kind of cost per head kind of way. So, it also meant that we got all of the functionality of GCC. We suddenly had, a full-blown Fortran compiler as well as a C++ compiler, where what we needed was a C compiler. But this was basically 2 orders of magnitude of value capture. Problem being that we're now living on a fork. So as an engineering manager, I am ecstatic that I've got 2 orders of magnitude of value capture, but the fork problem is real. So we needed to get all of our changes that allowed us to use GCC back upstream into the GCC project. The gotcha in that space is you very quickly discover that GCC is not one open source project, it is 5 that are tightly interlocked. And some of those folks loved our changes, and some of them hated the fact that we were doing anything on a Microsoft architecture 23, 4 years ago. At that point in history, living on our fork meant that every time GCC revved with new functionality and bug fixes, we'd be eating another 6 months of integration cost. Whereas if we could get our stuff merged, we're down to a month of cost. That's bringing our integration costs down into the 10K space. So I'm now playing with almost 3 orders of magnitude in terms of cost savings. So we turned around and we actually hired some GCC experts who had commit privileges in that project. And it's not that they just patched our stuff in, but they charged us about 40K to work our stuff in, reworked into, being well-formed GCC contributions. And so that's the kind of thing that, the engineering economics that people get excited about here. At no time were we doing this out of altruism. We were contributing back to the same hardening which we were benefiting from, but it also meant that we were saving another order of magnitude. And that's the reason that people get excited about this kind of capture of value in an open source project into a product or service that they sell to customers. So some of these people coming to you are probably very excited about the idea of somehow turning Odyssey into that kind of a product. And that's okay. Just understand that they need to fit into your community. You don't want to have to fit into theirs. Is that making sense for folks?
Absolutely.
So I want to bring you into the last piece of this talk to really open up this discussion about products versus projects. And I want to emphasize that in the same way that you were able to capture half a day of this discussion to start your future discussions, Paul knows how to get to me through Saeed. and I am part of Saeed's OSPO and the Institute of Applied Open Source. So I am giving you lots to think about. That doesn't mean you have to ask all of your questions today. So let me run you through the last piece. And that's this idea of talking about the difference between products and projects. And this is some of the tension that you're going to start to see as people enter your community, as you start to restructure and grow your community. And the number one thing I keep trying to hammer home for folks is this idea that projects are not products. And I have had this discussion vigorously with people for a long period of time, and I am right. This is one of the few places where I do put my foot down and say, yes, there's still things I am learning constantly in this space, even after 30 years, but this is one of the places where I've seen too many failures. So when you look at it, you know this from your own experience. A project is this wonderfully interesting bucket of technology developed by collaboratively like-minded engineers. Products solve customer problems for money. And there's even that dichotomy in when you publish your project under an OSI license, you are publishing outbound with no expectation in return. Product, by definition, there better be money coming in return. So, and then projects have communities. And the really interesting observation that came from Martin Mikos when he was CEO at MySQL, the company that supported and created the MySQL database engine. Communities have time and no money. That doesn't mean that you don't have community members that work for companies. But what it does mean is, in general, your community, they actually have time to contribute and they're willing to contribute. That's what all of your on-ramps have been about. Products and customers are the reverse problem. Customers have money and no time. They want a solution now. This is exactly the request you're seeing from people is, hey, can I buy this somewhere? Do I have to spend all of this time, kind of figuring out, am I on current revs and installing it on all of the machines? Or can I buy this thing where I just know that it's always going to be ready to go with its latest patches? And so that's the tension that you're seeing already. And it's not that those people don't want to contribute in community, but these are people that have money and no time. And when you step into those companies, and I say this having worked for many different companies of different sizes, from something as large as Microsoft, all the way down to my own startups and a number of different companies in between. Basically, a company builds three kinds of software. There's your core value proposition, the thing that customers pay money for. And then there's complement value add around it, which are the things that kind of make it look like a bigger, more complete solution to your customer. It's all the bells and whistles that might be there. And then there's context software this is just the tooling that you write for yourself. And this is what enables you to develop, build your core value proposition to customers. And that's it. That's the three types of software that you build as a software company. And if you look at open sourcing those things, I'm going to start with the context first, because that's the easy one. And the easy example here is Netflix shares under open source licenses all kinds of software. The example I typically pick is Spinnaker. That's their continuous integration, continuous deployment engine. So think of something like a Jenkins pipeline, if you're familiar with that. Spinnaker is the way Netflix does that kind of work. And if you publish that software under an OSI license, and then do the additional work to build a small community, you're basically validating your approach. You're demonstrating expertise. It's a really useful recruitment tool. And if you've done that small minimal community capture, you can capture innovation from outside sources back into it. If you step up into that next box, if you're doing things in complement value spaces, so remember, you're now starting to do something that's a little more strategic to the bottom line of the company. And if you publish projects in these complement spaces, you're starting to create stickiness and inertia around your core value. That's a good thing strategically. You're creating, experts and advocates around your technology. That's a good thing. Remember, you're selling a core value proposition and you're creating advocates for technology that you create. You're certainly hardening the complements, and you're indirectly capturing value to the core because you're capturing direct value into your complements. And you can even use this, think of Google and Kubernetes. It could be highly disruptive to competitors. Spaces like this, Azure publishes the command line version of the tools to get access to the Azure portal. All of that Azure CLI is an open source project. But when you step up into that next space where you're publishing your core value proposition under an open source license, you're now in a really dangerous space. Now, I'm not saying it can't be done, but you need to be really savvy and nuanced in what you're doing, because you're potentially turning partners into competitors. You're allowing your savvy customers to basically not become customers. They'll solve their problems with your project instead of buying your product. And you'll create no end of confusion for your sales and marketing folks. And you can see this because there's a collection of companies that have been doing this. So Mongo managed to make it to being public, but all three of these companies have had to relicense their open source projects. Now, these are companies that started a project and published it outbound as a customer capture mechanism. They thought they'd figure out how to monetize their community later. And that just doesn't work. And the fundamental problem, I'm going to skip over a slide here, is they've basically, this is Jeffrey Moore and the whole technology adoption life cycle. And the technology adoption life cycle and the chasm that Moore observed, that's 30 years old now. But basically those early adopters, when Moore talks about it, he's talking about them as customers. They're early adopting customers. And the problem is how to get across that chasm to your early majority customers. Whereas when you start here, and that if all of those early adopters are community members, you are not testing your customer adoption here. So this is some of the challenges that you end up with in these spaces. And so, if you can create an enormous amount of tension, and you actually end up diluting the power of contribution flow in your project if you are the sole owner of the project. So none of this is something that Odyssey's living with today, but any company that's starting to step into this space has to deal with these challenges. And so that's where, a couple of things that I was trying to help folks understand. there are lots of ways that companies can get involved in open source projects.
Oh, Steve?
Yep.
Oh, Andrew, you have a comment?
A question. So I just, given that we're really producing knowledge that's for the public benefit, that's what we as a community do. I just wonder if it doesn't play out a little differently than all the use cases that you're describing, where the profit motive ultimately has to be governing the viability of something. I think there is a sense of the mission of both corporate entities and governments and academic centers that are the major components of the Odyssey community, where they're willing to do things that may or may not be profitable. And that's one difference. The other is where competition really is part of the game. We want science to be competitive. We want people within the community to be coming at things from very different angles, trying to improve on the science and beat one another out in ways that ultimately add value. And so it was just in the back of my mind as you're going through these, whether you think that is a distinction at all, or if I've kind of misread the generality of what you're describing.
Well, if I could just chime in there, Andrew, I think there's a subtlety that I'd want to point out, because I really like how you framed this, Stephen. I was to make sure I got it right. But when we talk about that core value proposition, there's a difference between software that enables evidence generation versus the evidence itself. And I think of like
Exactly.
if I were to specify the Odyssey mission, our job is to improve health by generating reliable evidence that informs medical decisions. So from that perspective, the core proposition is the evidence. The tools that enable the evidence generation is not the thing that we're going to compete with.
Exactly so. And actually, to Andrew's point as well, it doesn't change the nature of the problem. I think, again, in that same way that you've got two classes of user. One is the user of the data that you're generating. The other is that closer group to the project, where the users of the software. I think it's that same kind of thing that you just want to be sensitive to folks entering your community with a profit mindset. And again, I'm not saying that they're wrong to enter the community. The idea that somebody might be taking distros that the community builds, that they help build in community, and then turning those into products is a perfectly fine thing. That's what the Linux community's been doing for literally decades now, 30 years now. It's just a matter of being sensitive to what those next steps might allow. It's, if anything, if were you to consider, for example, a nonprofit structure, and actually to answer the one question that was asked, and I think I sidestepped and I didn't mean to. The reason I don't think you have a liability problem to date is I think most of your community are employed by large organizations, and so none of you are carrying personal liability. Your organization is the one that if one of the research organizations hosted a meetup, it's the research organization that would eat that liability. You don't have, you're just getting to the point where companies are starting to show up that might actually care a little more about IP provenance if they were going to package up the software into a known released way. So it's up until now, I think, because most of your collaborative base are hubbed in well-established organizations. None of you have felt that, is what I think's been happening. There are lots of ways. The Fogel book is another good one here, of basically walking through, ways that companies can get involved. And so if you defined a C3, something for the public good, which sounds like it fits the Odyssey mission, that idea that corporate developers are showing up to help carry that maintenance burden, to help establish the ecosystem and grow that ecosystem, or to conceivably support some of the other things that are going on, carrying forward a marketing message, where the messaging is based on Odyssey, but their product messaging sits on top of that strong, vote of approval for Odyssey. That there's lots of things that companies can do in the Odyssey community. And, but those companies need to come in with a very healthy mindset of how they do things. Because a lot of companies that come into open source spaces, they'll treat developers as fungible resources. It doesn't, I have a developer, they're working on this thing. So, if that developer working for a company made lots of healthy contributions and you made them a committer, and then they leave that company to go work at a different company, from a project, from an Odyssey perspective, well, that committer's that committer. From the company that used to employ that committer, they might think, well, you need to give us a committer back. And it's like, no, you need to go and hire somebody new and work their way back up again, kind of thing. And so it's companies that begin to engage with open source communities need to think about those communities a little bit differently if they're consuming them. And in this case, you're very much in a world where companies would be coming into the Odyssey community from a consumption perspective. So that's kind of the challenges that I think you're going to be faced with in this kind of coming number of months as you start to think about next steps. The one other thing, like the summary slides, there's the one thing in the summary slides that I wanted to make sure everybody knew about. So these are the more useful references that you can take a look at. So the first one and the third one, Fogel's book and Lindbergh's book, those are two that I just used as textbooks in the course. Fogel's is very much written from the perspective of, so you've created an open source project and are building a community. So it's very much in line with what Odyssey's doing. As a really useful reference. The nice thing is Carl makes it available for free as a PDF as well. The intellectual property book, Van goes deep. It's probably more than you care to know right now, but it's just a really useful reference if you care about IP law and how to think about IP law. It is written for engineers, as opposed to being a book written by a lawyer for other lawyers. Vicky Brazur's book is a really good one from a community perspective of, so you want to get involved in this community, here's the things to go look for. So it's kind of the inverse perspective to Carl's. Vicky took it from the opposite point of view. And then lastly, the Red Hat open source team has been working on the open source way for a long time now. And that reference, it's an online reference, is again really useful collection of information and how to think about things in a really structured way. Now we're at time and I actually have a place I have to be. So I don't have more than a couple of minutes right now.
Stephen, thank you so much for giving us 4 hours of your time to walk us through this great conversation. So Odyssey stands for Observational Health, Data Science, and Informatics, but you opened your slide with Choose Your Own Adventure. And I think that fits us well because we pronounce it like the Greek Odyssey. And we always say Odyssey is really about the journey.
Yes,
and so we are on this journey and we are choosing our future. And this really gives us a lot of information to think about. And we would like to continue this conversation as we continue to mature.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, you and Saeed know how to find me whenever you want to have the next steps in the discussion. I am around, and I am active faculty at Johns Hopkins as well. So even though I'm back on the West Coast, I am absolutely looking forward to some piece of Odyssey, participating in next year's semesters of code in September. So, I need to be available to all of you fine folks to be able to, keep you on the hook in return.
That'd be wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen. This was really, really helpful. Appreciate it.
Take care, folks.
Thank you.
And thank everyone for joining us and staying with
Thanks
us.
so
for
much.
the
Yeah,
workshop.
thank you so much for your time today. I mean, this is a really impressive turnout. Well done, Paul.
Yeah,
Take care,
thank you.
folks.
Take care.